They say the worst betrayals don't come from enemies, but from the people who taught you what love was supposed to mean. My name is Nora Reed, and the day my mother texted, "Don't come by anymore. We're done," was the day everything I believed about family fractured. I'd spent years paying their bills, keeping our home afloat, thinking loyalty was love, until I found out what they'd really done behind my back. That message didn't end my life, it exposed it. What would you do if the people you trusted most built their happiness on your silence? Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Austin's sun stripes my studio desk when my phone rattles against the cutting mat. I expect a Slack ping. It's my mother. "Don't come by anymore. We're done. The family has decided." The words sit like a verdict. At 8:14 a.m., I'd wired her $1,500 for past due taxes because penalties were about to hit. Useful daughters move money without questions. I'm Nora Reed, 28, a freelance designer in East Austin. After my dad walked out a decade ago, silence moved into our house, and I learned to fix things. You can't hear bills, schedules, moods. Being useful became the way I loved confirmation numbers, new filters in the vents. My brother's flat tire changed at midnight. Carol, my mother called me her rock. Rocks don't speak. I try to work hero image button states type scale, but the grid fuzzes. Don't come by anymore. We're done. The family has decided. Family is my mother, my younger brother Dylan, and Aunt Nancy 5 blocks away. They're a trio when there's a vote, and I'm the fourth chair pulled in from the garage. Dylan sells houses with a grin. Nancy bakes lemon cakes and keeps a ledger of favors. Carol can cry on command. My job has been simple: arrive with the solution and vanish. By noon, I decide it's a mood sent as policy. Maybe she meant not today. Maybe we're done means for now. I touch the text, reread the punctuation, tell myself if it's serious, she'll call. I eat over the sink, answer a client FaceTime with my bright voice, and ignore how my thumb keeps finding messages like a bruise. If the family has decided when did they meet, I scroll our thread and find grocery photos and Dylan's closing day selfies. The afternoon limps, Slack, exports. A notification: Aunt Nancy's post-family night deserves something sweet. Dylan adds a boomerang of champagne flutes. My mother says nothing. I flip my phone face down, then up again. Work is the only place where cause meets effect. Click, drag, export. Something changes because I moved it. At 5, my hotel client approves the homepage and adds a line that almost undoes me. "Couldn't have done this without you, Nora." I shut down, tell myself I'm going to the UPS store and then home. My car disagrees. It knows the way to Maple Creek. Dusk lays a bruise across the sky. I park under the streetlight that used to halo my dad when he taught Dylan jump shots and told me to keep time. I say I will not look. Then I look. 3 cars in the driveway. Dylan's white Range, Aunt Nancy's Honda, a gray sedan. I don't know. The living room glows butter yellow, and because the curtains are drawn the way my family draws lines sloppily too late, I can see everything. The table is set with the good plates. Carol sits at the head, shoulders, soft, a glass catching light. Dylan leans back in a chair I once repaired. Aunt Nancy reaches for a platter, laughing. My phone vibrates. Dylan has posted a wide shot of the table, my mother's arm around his shoulders. Aunt Nancy mid-laugh. "Love these family dinners. So blessed." Comments stack. "Family is everything. Cut out toxic energy and watch your life bloom." My mother taps a heart. I tell myself to leave. I lock my doors instead. Another ping, a boomerang of my mother tapping her glass. Caption: "To the people who show up." 4 glasses rise. I count them. I was always the 5th. Even after my father left, there was a chair for me. Even when I paid for emergencies that lined up with holidays, I had a place. I scroll my camera roll for proof I existed and find what I always find: patched drywall, air filters, payment confirmations. The small ledger of usefulness. Useful girls shoulder a house like a backpack and pretend it isn't heavy. A memory shakes loose my father at the kitchen table sorting bills, mortgage, utilities, car, saying, "Money is choices, not love." He left the next spring, and I've confused the two ever since. This morning, taxes. Last month, a plumber. The month before, a medical payment that now reads like a deposit for a catered party. The math clicks with the tidy cruelty of a padlock. Inside, Dylan lifts his glass. My mother leans toward him with that pride she saves for him, chin-tipped eyes bright, the expression that says, "The best parts of me came true in you." I used to get that look when I brought home straight A's, when I fixed things before being asked. Somewhere between then and now, the spotlight swung and stayed. Their laughter swells. My face heats with the humiliation of standing outside your own house like a trespasser. I think about ringing the bell. I picture the pause, the rearranging my mother's gentle weapon. "Not tonight, Nora. We're having family time." I picture myself saying, "I am family," and watch the sentence die in the foyer. I could force it and spend a week apologizing. I could drive home and send another wire to buy my way back. The options unfurl like a bad menu, everything salty or sweet, nothing nourishing. 8 o'clock blinks on the dash. Inside, the stranger at the table makes a toast. My mother lifts her glass, says something I can't hear, but know by heart it begins with gratitude and ends with strength that somehow always translates to mine. I realize I've been auditioning for a role that was filled years ago. I realize the emergency I keep paying to prevent is loneliness. I back away from the curb. A red light catches me on Riverside. A junk mail text offers triple points for a new card. Money is choices. I make one small choice: I will not explain myself tonight. I will not edit my mother's sentences into something that doesn't wound. Home is quiet. I plug in my phone. The lock screen blooms with a photo of Grandma Lillian's blue bowl of lemons. "I brought it here for safekeeping," my mother said, "because big dinners break things." I set the bowl in this cabinet and close the door softly. I open my banking app and scroll the transfers with the detached curiosity of a stranger. Confirmation numbers line up with holidays. Emergencies look like events. It isn't proof. It's enough to feel the ground tilt. I go back to the text thread. My last message sent on reflex sits there like a dare. Got it. What I have is a windshield's worth of distance and a view of a life that functions without me except for the parts I fund. I stand very still and count my breaths. When they slow, something quieter than anger and older than grief settles in. It isn't courage, it's clarity. I don't call my mother. I don't reply. I let the 3 sentences sit where she left them. "Don't come by anymore. We're done. The family has decided." Against my better judgment, I check Dylan's feed once more. The newest photo shows the table from another angle. My mother turning toward the gray sedan stranger, the wine, the smiles, and in the window glass, the faint silhouette of my car at the curb. I am there, and I am not. The realization lands with the soft finality of a stamp erased. The morning after the dinner I wasn't invited to, I woke up to the kind of silence that feels intentional. My phone didn't light up with Mom's good morning texts, or Dylan's half-baked memes about work stress. I told myself the family just needed space, but the truth was simpler: they'd already taken it. I made coffee in the chipped turquoise mug I'd had since college, the one that's seen every overworked night of my 20s, and opened Instagram out of habit. The algorithm was cruelly efficient. The first post was Dylan's from last night. Family night success, couldn't ask for better people. He'd tagged Mom, Aunt Nancy, even the stranger from the gray sedan, whose username read @Madeline Markets. My mother commented 3 red hearts. My name wasn't there, not even as a tag someone forgot to remove. Scrolling back, I saw months of posts I'd somehow missed. Dylan grilling steaks in Mom's backyard in March. Aunt Nancy's birthday in May. A Sunday brunch tradition in June. Every photo had the same caption pattern: family laughter, togetherness. Each one dated suspiciously close to the times Mom had called me sobbing about overdue bills or broken appliances. I started cross-referencing with my bank app. The pattern was perfect, every crisis aligned with a party. April 12th, $700 for a water heater. The same weekend, Dylan posted pool day with the best crew. July 3rd, $1,200 emergency air conditioning repair. Nancy's 4th of July bash. I had been buying food decorations, maybe even the fireworks for gatherings I wasn't welcome at. I felt stupid. No, I felt complicit. At my shared workspace downtown, I tried to bury the anger under deadlines. The world outside still functioned. People tapping keyboards, laughter from the copywriting pod, the smell of burnt espresso. My friend Emily leaned over the divider. She's one of those people who can spot tension like radar. "You look like someone stole your dog," she said softly. I told her the condensed version, family text, social media silence. She raised her brows. "You've been their safety net, Nora. They're not cutting you off. They're cutting off their cash flow and pretending it's empowerment." I tried to laugh, but the words landed like truth usually does, unwelcome, sharp, undeniable. At lunch, I opened Facebook and saw something worse. My mother had changed her profile photo to one of her and Dylan hugging in front of Grandma Lillian's old house. The caption read, "New beginnings for the Reeds. Grateful for the ones who lift you up." Comments poured in. "You deserve peace. Family first. Cut out negativity." My chest tightened. I wasn't mentioned, but the absence was its own headline. I drove home early, opened my laptop and typed Nora Reed GoFundMe. I don't know what made me think to search it, maybe instinct, maybe masochism. There it was, a fundraiser titled, "Help Mom Recover from Health Struggles." The description said she was battling chronic fatigue and facing mounting medical bills. The organizer was Dylan. The goal, $25,000. The total so far, $18,420. My stomach dropped when I saw the top contributor, me. The recurring transfer I'd been sending every month for house expenses was automatically deposited into the GoFundMe through Dylan's linked account. My mother's illness didn't exist. The money I'd been sending to keep the lights on had been spent publicly to fund their performances of resilience. I shut the screen, but the anger didn't fade. It kept growing until it needed movement. I drove to Maple Creek again, half intending to confront them, half hoping for a mistake that would make this forgivable. The porch light was off. Through the blinds, the house looked peaceful, empty, self-satisfied. On the doorframe, the welcome mat I'd given Mom last Christmas, stitched with "Home is where the heart stays," had been flipped upside down. It felt like a message. I sat in the car until the sky bruised purple. I wasn't crying. I was calculating. For years, I'd believed that love meant paying for what others refused to handle. That's what Mom had taught me when Dad left. Be the responsible one, the helper, the fixer. "You're strong, Nora. You can take it." I had taken it rent for her car repairs, for Dylan Aunt Nancy's temporary loan that was going on year 3. Every dollar was proof of loyalty, and every silence was my receipt. I didn't go home right away. I ended up at a taco truck on East Cesar Chavez, sitting under string lights trying to taste something normal. Emily called after seeing I'd clocked out early. "You okay?" she asked. "Define okay," I said. I told her everything. The GoFundMe, the upside-down mat, the social media posts. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered perspective. "Listen, you can't guilt your way into being loved. That's not how family's supposed to work here, or anywhere. You earn respect by stopping the cycle." I looked around at strangers laughing over tacos, the ordinary hum of people building lives that weren't traps. She was right. Respect had to start with me. When I got home, I opened my laptop again and began a quiet kind of investigation. Not emotional, not hysterical, methodical. Screenshots of posts, timestamps of bank transfers, notes cross-checked with the crisis texts Mom had sent. I filled a folder labeled simply records. At first it felt paranoid, then protective. Somewhere between the second and third file, I realized I was documenting a pattern of financial abuse, not just hurt feelings. It was bigger than rejection. It was extraction. Around midnight, I scrolled one last time through my mother's Facebook. That's when I noticed a small notification in the sidebar, Public notices near you. A probate filing caught my eye. Lillian Reed estate applicant. Carol Reed. Grandma's name. My breath caught. There'd been no call, no funeral invitation, no announcement. The date of death listed 2 months ago. My grandmother, the only person who ever made me feel chosen, was gone, and the family had said nothing. I reread the filing, making sure it wasn't another Reed. But there was no mistake. My mother had filed for probate as executor of Grandma's estate. My name appeared nowhere in the record. The shock was cold this time, not fiery like the betrayal before. It settled in my bones, clear and precise. Grandma had left me letters over the years, handwritten, lavender-scented, full of her favorite lines about fairness and work ethic. She always said, "I'll make sure you're taken care of, kiddo." I used to laugh that off. Now I wondered if she'd meant it literally. I called Aunt Nancy, straight to voicemail. I texted, "Why didn't anyone tell me about Grandma?" The message showed delivered, then nothing. I typed another, "When was the funeral?" and deleted it. The answer was already in the silence. I sat on the floor, surrounded by files and receipts, the air conditioner rattling like an old man coughing. The pieces lined up: family parties paid with my donations, fake medical fundraisers, now a hidden estate. The betrayal wasn't impulsive, it was systematic, and that meant it could be proven. I thought of my grandmother's farmhouse in Wimberley, the porch swing, the smell of cedar, the sound of her radio humming, Patsy Cline. I thought of the promise she made that I'd always have a home there. Maybe that was the real reason my family cut me out. Maybe I wasn't meant to be the provider anymore. Maybe I was the obstacle. The clock ticked past 1. I opened my email and found a contact from an old Christmas card Grandma had sent Lawrence Henson, attorney at law. My hands shook as I typed, "Mr. Henson, I'm Nora Reed, Lillian Reed's granddaughter. Could we talk about her estate? I believe there may have been a misunderstanding." I hovered over send, then hit it before I could talk myself out of it. For the first time in years, I didn't end the night feeling guilty. I felt something closer to purpose. It wasn't revenge yet, just curiosity with a spine. Still, the anger was there, steady and clean, no longer tangled with obligation. I closed my laptop and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere between the lies and the silence, my family had made one mistake: they'd taught me how to solve problems. They just forgot I could solve them without them. When I was a kid, Grandma Lillian used to tell me that fairness wasn't about equal slices, it was about who baked the pie. She lived in a weathered farmhouse on the edge of Wimberley, where the air smelled like cedar and rain on limestone. Every summer, I'd spend 2 weeks there chasing stray cats and shelling peas on the porch while cicadas screamed in the trees. Grandma believed in doing things the right way, even when nobody was watching. "Integrity is what you do when it's just you and the truth," she'd say, tapping my forehead like she was planting the idea there for later. Turns out later was now. Mr. Henson's office was in an old brick building near the courthouse, the kind that smelled like paper and coffee that had been reheated one too many times. When I called that morning, his assistant had sounded startled. "You're Lillian's granddaughter?" she asked. "Mr. Henson's been trying to reach you for weeks." The words twisted in my stomach. He had my number, but my family had clearly intercepted the calls. When I arrived, he greeted me with a handshake that felt heavy with something unspoken. He was in his 70s, sharp eyes behind wire frames, the kind of man who spent a lifetime keeping secrets safe until they're supposed to be found. "I'm glad you reached out, Nora," he said, motioning me into a leather chair that squeaked when I sat down. "Your grandmother thought the world of you. She was very clear about her intentions." He pulled out a manila folder stamped with the estate number I'd seen online. "Before she fell ill, she signed a will naming you as the primary heir, house land, and a portion of her savings. But your mother filed a newer version, supposedly signed 6 months ago, leaving everything to her and your brother. I had questions about its validity, but they said you wanted no involvement." That didn't sound like the Nora I knew. My throat tightened. "I didn't even know she was gone," I whispered. He slid a document across the desk, the new will. The signature looked perfect, steady, confident. But the date next to it, February 14th, was just 2 weeks after Grandma's doctor told me she'd stopped recognizing faces. I remember visiting her that Valentine's Day. She'd looked at me like a polite stranger, smiled weakly, and asked if I'd like tea. She could barely hold the cup. There's no way she could have written her name, let alone signed legal paperwork. Mr. Henson leaned forward. I've represented your grandmother for 40 years. She was meticulous. She called me 3 months before her diagnosis to confirm that the existing will would stay unchanged. She said she trusted you because you never asked for anything. His voice softened. Nora, your grandmother's assets were modest but meaningful, her house a small investment account, some antiques. It's not about the money, though. It's about her wishes. If this newer document is fraudulent, it's a crime. The word crime echoed in my head. Until then, I'd been thinking in emotional terms: betrayal, manipulation, guilt. Now it sounded different. Legal. Concrete. I asked to see the signature again. My hands trembled as I held the paper. Grandma's handwriting used to wobble even on her best days. This one was smooth as typeface. Did Mom or Dylan bring this to you? I asked. He nodded. Your mother delivered it with your brother and a man she introduced as their advisor, Eli Cortez. She said he was helping with estate logistics. I recognized the name immediately. Eli was Dylan's slick real estate partner, the one who wore too much cologne and called me kiddo even though I was older. I'd once caught him bragging about notarizing documents creatively to close deals faster. My chest burned. Mr. Henson watched my face. Do you want to contest it? He asked. I wanted to say yes, but I didn't know what that meant yet. Contesting meant lawyers' court dates, confrontation, the kind of war my family would spin as cruelty. Still doing nothing would make me complicit again. I need to know more first, I said. Can I get a copy of the original will? He smiled faintly, as if Grandma had predicted this moment. Already made one for you, he said, sliding a sealed envelope across the desk. She asked me to keep it safe. You should read her note inside. It's very her. Driving home, I opened the envelope at a stoplight. Inside was the old will and a short handwritten letter dated 3 years earlier. My dear Nora, this is just in case something happens before I can say it again. You see people for who they are, not what they can give you. That's rare. Don't let anyone convince you that love means debt. You owe no one your peace. Love, Grandma. I pulled over and cried until my throat ached. Not the soft movie kind of crying, the guttural, wordless kind that shakes everything loose. When I finally looked up, the world outside the windshield looked too normal. Traffic lights, joggers, a woman walking her dog. None of them knew that my entire understanding of family had just collapsed. But grief has a way of sharpening things. I wiped my face and started the car again, heading not home, but toward the nursing home in San Marcos, where Grandma had spent her last year. The receptionist recognized me immediately. You're Miss Nora. Your grandma always lit up when you came. Her words hit harder than she intended. I'm so sorry for your loss, she added. I asked if I could speak to her old nurse, Patricia Gomez. A few minutes later, Patricia came out, a petite woman with silver streaks in her hair and eyes that didn't flinch from hard truths. I was wondering when you'd show up, she said, leading me to a quiet lounge. I wasn't sure if you knew. I told her I'd found out accidentally. She sighed. Your grandma was special. She trusted me with little things, favorite music, snack routines. But around January, things started getting strange. Your mother and brother began visiting more often, always asking for private time with her. I didn't think much of it until one afternoon I walked in and saw them with a man. Dark hair suit, smelled like expensive cologne. He was guiding your grandmother's hand across a stack of papers while she was half asleep from her medication. I asked what was happening, and your mother told me it was just some routine updates for the insurance. The words made my scalp prickle. Patricia looked uneasy. After that, I noticed more papers being signed. The nursing home director told me not to question it, said the family knew best. But your grandmother's condition then? She couldn't even write her own name clearly. I stared at the table between us, the wood grains swimming. Do you remember the date? She thought for a moment. Mid-February, right before Valentine's Day. She had that red cardigan on, the same day marked on the will. My heart pounded. Would you be willing to make a statement about what you saw? I asked. She hesitated. I'd have to be careful. The director's connected, he doesn't like staff getting involved in family disputes. I'm not looking for drama, I said quietly. I just want the truth. She deserves that. Patricia studied me for a long time, then nodded slowly. I'll think about it. But if you're going to fight them, you'd better have proof. Driving back, I replayed every word, every image of Grandma's frail hand being moved like a puppet. The rage that had been simmering for days began to focus sharp and cold. They hadn't just stolen from me, they'd stolen her dignity. The people who'd mocked me for being too emotional had used a dying woman as a financial tool. At home, I spread the two wills side by side on my kitchen table. The old one shaky but alive with personality, the new one immaculate and soulless. I traced Grandma's uneven loops with my fingertip. I thought of Mr. Henson's warning: if it's fraudulent, it's a crime. I could almost hear Grandma's voice saying, "Integrity, Nora, even when it's just you and the truth." By midnight, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to beg for my family's approval anymore. I was going to prove what they'd done. Grandma might have been too weak to sign her name, but she'd left me something stronger, a sense of right and wrong, that didn't shake even when everything else did. And that I realized was the real inheritance they'd tried to bury. The next morning, I woke before dawn, adrenaline already running my pulse like a motor. I couldn't shake the image of my grandmother's limp hand being forced across paper. I drove back to San Marcos, coffee burning in the cup holder, rehearsing what I'd say if the nursing home staff tried to stop me. Patricia met me by the side entrance instead of the front desk. Her scrubs were wrinkled eyes tired, but she had that same steady calm I'd seen before. "You sure you want to dig into this?" she asked. "Once you do, there's no going back." I nodded. "I already did when I called you." She exhaled and led me into a small supply closet that smelled like disinfectant and metal. From her pocket, she pulled a flash drive in a clear evidence bag. "Security footage," she said. "From February 14th, the day they came." I downloaded it before the system wiped after 30 days. I told the director the cameras malfunctioned that day. I stared at the bag in her hand. "You risked your job for this." She gave a faint smile. "For your grandmother, yes. She was kind to everyone here. She didn't deserve what they did." I asked if she'd go on record about what she saw. "If you can protect me," she said quietly. "The director's in with them. He told me to stay loyal to the people who pay your salary." My stomach tightened. That explained why the home ignored everything. "I'll protect you," I said. "You have my word." When I got home, I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. The footage was grainy but clear enough. The timestamp matched the will date. I watched my mother and Dylan enter Grandma's room with Eli, all three glancing at the door like they didn't belong there. Grandma lay half-reclined, IV dripping beside her. Eli placed papers on a clipboard, held Grandma's wrist, and moved it across the page while my mother steadied the board. My brother stood near the door, pretending to watch the hallway. Grandma's head tilted once as if she were waking, but Eli pressed her hand down again. My throat closed. I paused the video, stared at the frozen frame, my family committing a crime with the casual teamwork of people passing dishes at a dinner table. I printed screenshots, labeled them with the timestamp, and slid them into plastic sleeves. I felt detached, clinical. Emotion would come later. Now I needed precision. I spent the rest of the day compiling everything. Bank transfers, copies of both wills, Patricia's handwritten note describing what she saw. When I was done, the folder was thick enough to make a sound when it hit the table. That evening, I drove to a copy store to scan everything and create digital backups. The clerk, a college kid with headphones, didn't notice how hard my hands were shaking. I left with 3 USB drives, one for me, one for Mr. Henson, one to hide somewhere safe. For the first time in days, I felt in control. But control is fragile. When I stepped out into the parking lot, I saw 2 deep gashes slashed through the sidewalls of my tires. A scrap of paper tucked under the wiper fluttered in the wind. Drop it. You're not family anymore. No signature. The letters were printed in thick marker, blocky and masculine. My breath came shallow. I scanned the lot empty except for a white truck idling near the exit. Its headlights blinked once, then it rolled away. I didn't go to the police that night. Maybe I should have, but fear and fury don't always act rationally. I just drove home on the spare tire, windows down, so I could hear if anyone followed. Every red light felt like exposure. Once inside, I deadbolted the door and stacked the evidence folder on the counter like a barrier. My phone buzzed, unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short. Stop digging, Nora. Some things you don't want to find. The voice was low but familiar. Eli. I sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the flash drive glowing faintly in the USB port. I thought about calling Emily but couldn't explain without unraveling everything. Instead, I opened my grandmother's old letters. One line from years ago jumped out. Bravery isn't loud, sweetheart. It's steady. I repeated that until my hands stopped trembling. Then I started making calls. The next morning, I met Mr. Henson again. He examined the footage without a word, just adjusted his glasses and watched it twice. When it ended, he leaned back slowly. This isn't just unethical, he said. It's felony elder fraud. We'll need to bring in the authorities, but let me reach out to a detective I trust first. I told him about the threats and slashed tires. He frowned. Then it's even more important you don't confront them alone. Let the system work for once. His confidence felt like scaffolding around my panic. We made copies of everything, logged the timestamps, and prepared an official complaint for the Elder Fraud Division. By afternoon, Detective Morrison called me directly. His voice was gravely deliberate. Ms. Reed, we've seen cases like this before. They count on fear and family loyalty to keep people quiet. You did the right thing bringing it forward. Hearing those words cracked something open inside me, validation after years of being gaslit into silence. Still, I wasn't naive. My family wouldn't fold easily. They'd built their lives on manipulation polished to charm. If they sensed what was coming, they'd twist it. I needed to be strategic and visible until the moment counted. That night, I went through my apartment, deleting old shared accounts, bank access, cloud storage, anything my mother might still know passwords for. I updated every login, changed locks, and moved the flash drives into a safety deposit box downtown. I felt like someone preparing for a storm they couldn't stop, only brace against. By midnight, exhaustion hit, but sleep wouldn't come. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from Dylan. Mom says you're confused. Don't make things worse. Let's talk. I stared at it until the screen dimmed. There was no apology, no denial, just control wrapped in concern. I didn't answer. I'd spent my whole life mistaking guilt for loyalty. Not anymore. In the morning light, I drove back to the ranch for the first time since Grandma's death. The gate creaked like it recognized me. Weeds had crawled through the gravel, but the porch swing still moved in the breeze, steady and patient. I sat there with my coffee and the quiet weight of everything I'd uncovered. For years, I'd given my family every resource, money, time, forgiveness. And in return, they'd stolen not just my savings, but my story. But now, sitting where Grandma once watched the sunrise, I realized they'd miscalculated. They'd taught me competence. They'd made me resilient. They'd just never imagined I'd use it against them. By the time I left, I had a plan. I'd work with Henson and the detective to prepare the case, but I also wanted something undeniable, something that would expose them publicly, not just legally. I didn't know what that would look like yet, but I knew one thing for sure: the truth was mine now, and I wasn't letting it go. As I turned back onto the highway, the morning sun hit the rearview mirror, blinding me for a second. When the glare cleared, my reflection looked different, harder maybe, but freer. For the first time, I wasn't driving toward their approval. I was driving toward the reckoning. The morning of the will reading felt like standing on the edge of a storm. I woke before the alarm, dressed in dark slacks and a pressed blouse that smelled faintly of cedar from the ranch closet. My hands were steady for once. I'd already memorized the plan: arrive at 10, not 3, because I knew my mother would try to misdirect me. Mr. Henson had confirmed the true time yesterday, warning that Carol had requested the later slot just for family convenience. Family convenience was code for ambush. Downtown Austin on a Monday morning was all glass reflections and noise. I parked 2 blocks from Henson's office, holding the folder of evidence close like a weapon. Patricia met me in the lobby, her face pale but resolved. "You sure you're ready for this?" she asked. "No," I said, "but I'm done being scared." Behind her stood Dr. Marissa Lee, the handwriting expert I'd hired using my emergency fund money I'd once saved for a down payment. "Let's make this clean," Dr. Lee said. Her tone had the precision of a scalpel. Detective Morrison arrived last in plain clothes, a badge tucked discreetly in his jacket. His presence anchored the chaos building in my chest. At 9:58, we entered the conference room together. It smelled like lemon polish and old paper. My mother looked up from her seat at the head of the table, surprise flickering for half a second before she masked it with a smile. Dylan sat beside her in a tailored navy suit, smirking like this was a business meeting he'd already closed. Eli leaned against the wall near the window, pretending to scroll through his phone. A man in an expensive charcoal suit. Their new lawyer shuffled papers nervously. My mother recovered first. "Nora," she said warmly, like I'd wandered in by mistake. "We didn't expect you until this afternoon. You must have gotten the times mixed up." "No," I said, taking the chair opposite her. "I got the right time, the one on the official notice." Her smile thinned, but she didn't reply. Mr. Henson cleared his throat and began. "We're here to execute the reading of the last will and testament of Lillian Reed. For the record, all beneficiaries and legal representatives are present." His voice was steady, but his eyes flicked toward me like a signal. He opened a folder and started reading the document my mother had submitted, the forged will. Listening to the words was like hearing my grandmother's voice twisted into something unrecognizable. Everything house savings jewelry was left to Carol and Dylan. Not a word about me. I watched my mother lean back, hands folded, performing grief like an actress who'd done too many takes. Dylan gave me a sympathetic shrug, the kind that said you had to know this was coming. When Mr. Henson finished, silence pooled in the room. My mother reached across the table and patted my hand. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she said. "We'll make sure you get something. Maybe Grandma's old cookbooks, you loved those, didn't you?" Something inside me clicked. "No," I said quietly. "You won't need to worry about that, because I'm contesting the will." Her hand froze. "Excuse me. Based on evidence of fraud and elder abuse." I opened my folder and slid the printed screenshots across the table, one after another, the footage stills, the signature comparisons, Patricia's statement, the forensic report. The air shifted. Mr. Henson nodded to Dr. Lee. She stood, connected her tablet to the conference screen, and began her presentation. "These are samples of Lillian Reed's signatures from 2017 to 2020, she said. "Notice the tremor in the baseline, the uneven pressure consistent with progressive Parkinson's. Now here is the signature from the 2022 will. The pen pressure is firm, the baseline steady, and the letter forms identical to a traced sample. In my professional opinion, this was forged." Dylan's smirk faltered. My mother's knuckles whitened around her pen. The lawyer tried to interject. "We're not prepared, but—" Patricia's voice cut through him. "You should be." She plugged her phone into the monitor and the security footage began to play. Grainy black and white video filled the room. Grandma unconscious, my mother holding her wrist, Eli guiding the pen, Dylan standing guard. The timestamp glowed in the corner, February 14th, 2022. For a moment, nobody breathed. The lawyer's face went gray. Dylan's mouth opened, then shut. Eli swore under his breath. My mother lurched forward, fumbling for Patricia's phone. "Turn that off. You don't know what you're seeing." Detective Morrison stood, badge visible now. "We know exactly what we're seeing, Mrs. Reed. Please stay seated." The lawyer stammered something about context and misunderstanding, but Morrison ignored him. My mother turned on me, then her face twisting. "You planned this. You set us up. After everything I've done for you. You mean everything I've paid for?" The words came out calm, colder than I intended. The bills, the fake emergencies, the GoFundMe. All of it. I wasn't supposed to find out about Grandma because you were too busy cashing in her life before she was gone. Dylan slammed his palm on the table. "That's enough, Nora. You're destroying this family." Morrison stepped between us. "Sit down, Mr. Reed." Eli tried to slip out the door, but another officer waiting in the hallway blocked his path. The room felt smaller, air thick with panic. My mother looked around wildly, realizing the script was no longer hers. "This is ridiculous," she said, voice cracking. "You can't prove intent." I reached into my folder one last time and pulled out a stack of papers I hadn't mentioned yet, Grandma's medical reports. "These show she couldn't even hold a pen the day you claimed she signed that will. You forged your own mother's name." I slid them across the table and her eyes darted over the dates. The color drained from her face. Detective Morrison moved forward, reading them quickly before giving a small nod. "Mrs. Reed, Mr. Cortez, you're all under investigation for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. You have the right to remain silent." The lawyer sputtered protests as Morrison signaled to the officers outside. Eli's bravado collapsed. He backed into the wall, muttering that it wasn't his idea. Dylan's shoulders sagged. My mother just sat there frozen until the cuffs clicked around her wrists. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were full of something like awe and hatred mixed together. "You think this makes you family again?" she hissed. "You think this makes you better?" "No," I said softly. "It just makes me free." They were escorted out one by one. The lawyer gathered his briefcase with trembling hands, mumbling about conflict of interest. The room emptied until it was just me, Patricia, and Mr. Henson. The lemon-polished air felt new, lighter somehow. Patricia touched my shoulder. "She'd be proud of you," she said. I believed her. Outside, the sky had cleared. The storm passed, but not gone. As I watched the police cars pull away, I realized this wasn't the end. It was the hinge, the moment everything that had been hidden turned toward the light. And even as fear whispered that my family would come for me again, another voice, older and steadier, said, "What Grandma always had. Stand tall, sweetheart. Truth doesn't need permission." The morning after the arrests, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Missed calls, text messages, voicemail alerts. It felt like the digital equivalent of being swarmed. I turned the phone face down on my kitchen table and let it buzz. By noon, curiosity won. The first message I opened wasn't from a friend or even a relative, it was from a journalist. "Nora Reed, can you confirm reports your mother was detained for forgery related to the Lillian Reed estate?" The story had already leaked. The local paper's website featured a grainy photo of my mother outside the courthouse, sunglasses on, chin high, the headline framing her as a misunderstood matriarch, community volunteer accused in family dispute. The comments were vicious. Half the town thought I was an ungrateful daughter ruining my mother's life for money. The other half smelled scandal and loved it. By the end of the week, Carol and Dylan were both out on bail. That's when the second act of their performance began. Mom launched a fundraiser called Justice for Carol Reed, claiming she was the victim of a vindictive daughter who manipulated an elderly nurse and framed her grieving family. Dylan reposted it with the caption, "Some people will do anything for inheritance." The page raised $5,000 in a day. My name trended locally for all the wrong reasons. The narrative had flipped. At first, I tried to defend myself online, commenting facts under their posts linking to public court filings. But the internet doesn't want evidence. It wants emotion. Every correction I posted was buried under accusations of jealousy and greed. So I stopped. Silence became my new defense. Instead, I doubled down on what I could control the case. Detective Morrison kept me updated daily. "We found more," he told me one afternoon. "Transfers from other elderly clients your mother assisted. 2 confirmed signatures match the same forgery pattern. She and your brother weren't just exploiting your grandmother, they were running a small-scale scheme. The information didn't bring joy, only clarity. It meant my family's betrayal wasn't personal. It was professional. They'd perfected it." I met with Mr. Henson again to prepare for the next hearing. His office had become a kind of war room, binders of exhibits stacked high, a whiteboard mapping out timelines of deceit. We traced the money trail my emergency payments funneled through accounts labeled care services checks, written from Grandma's trust, to companies that didn't exist. Dylan's real estate firm had been the hub, Eli's name appearing on more documents than I could count. "They built a business model on empathy," Henson said grimly, "and they used yours as the prototype." The days blurred together after that. Work took a back seat. My clients were patient but puzzled. Emily stopped by one night with takeout and a blunt truth. "You can't win both wars, Nora," she said. "You can't prove them wrong and convince everyone you're good. Pick one." She was right. I chose the quieter war. I started journaling evidence, recording every call, saving every voicemail. The calm helped. It reminded me that chaos could be cataloged if you named it properly. A week later, a subpoena arrived, requiring my testimony at the preliminary hearing. The same night, I got a voicemail that made my blood run cold. It was Eli's voice, distorted slightly, but unmistakable. "If you testify, you'll regret it. Families can forgive, but the internet never does." The threat was vague but effective. I didn't sleep. I forwarded the message to Detective Morrison first thing in the morning. "We'll trace it," he said, but I could hear in his tone that tracing wasn't simple. Fear had a way of shrinking the world, but I refused to crawl back into the version of myself they'd built, the daughter who stayed quiet to keep the peace. The next hearing was brutal. My mother arrived in a cream suit, hair perfectly set, looking like she was attending church instead of facing charges. She didn't look at me once. Dylan followed behind, his expression carefully neutral. When I took the stand, their lawyer tried to reframe everything: that I'd misunderstood the medical records, that the nurse had vendettas, that the video was misinterpreted due to medication confusion. I stayed composed, answering each question with measured precision. The footage spoke louder than any accusation. When Patricia testified, her voice trembled but never broke. The courtroom was silent when the prosecutor played the full clip, the movement of Grandma's limp hand across the paper, the timestamp glowing in the corner. Afterward, outside the courthouse, a small group of supporters waited, mostly strangers who'd seen the footage online once the district released it to the press. They thanked me for coming forward. I didn't feel heroic. I felt emptied out, like I'd spent my last drop of adrenaline. Still, when one elderly woman grabbed my hand and said, "You saved others from them," I finally understood what closure might feel like, not triumph, but relief that the cycle could stop with me. That night, Carol posted again. A long, rambling letter about daughters who forget where they came from. It ended with, "Blood may not matter to her, but it does to me. Pray for my lost child." The comments flooded with sympathy. I didn't answer. I closed the app and turned my phone off for 3 days. During that silence, something remarkable happened. My anxiety ebbed. Without the constant noise of their lies, my world got quiet enough for me to think. I spent that time helping Detective Morrison sort through additional evidence. Together we built a timeline stretching back years: fake signatures, phony caregiver invoices, property transfers disguised as gifts. My family had been preying on people long before Grandma's estate. It wasn't just fraud, it was their legacy. Morrison's words stuck with me. "This isn't about revenge anymore, Ms. Reed. This is about stopping predators." And that's when my purpose shifted. I stopped seeing this as a feud and started seeing it as prevention. My family's downfall could protect others, and that meant I couldn't falter. I learned how to file public records, draft affidavits, preserve chain of custody. The same meticulousness that once kept my family functioning was now dismantling their empire. When the next article came out, elder fraud case expands beyond family dispute. I didn't feel vindicated, but I smiled anyway. The truth was finally louder than the lie. My mother's fundraiser shut down 2 days later. Their lawyer withdrew. The comments stopped. I knew the story wasn't over. Trials move slowly and people forget quickly. But sitting on my balcony that night, Austin's skyline glowing like distant embers, I understood that silence can be power when it's chosen, not forced. They could twist the narrative all they wanted, but facts have a way of finding daylight. The storm had become something else, a current I could ride instead of drown in. And for the first time since the text that started it all, I didn't feel erased. I felt undeniable. By late summer, the court had frozen Grandma's assets pending final judgment, which meant the ranch, the one my mother used for her social media posts about family legacy, was legally under my stewardship. The irony didn't escape me. When the invitation arrived in my inbox, Reed Family Reunion, hosted at the beloved Lillian Reed Ranch. The email came from Aunt Nancy, who still hadn't spoken to me directly since the arrest. She wrote, "We hope everyone can come together and heal." It was set for 2 weeks from Sunday. The list of confirmed attendees included over 100 relatives. My mother's name was there too, along with Dylan's, both marked confirmed. They were out on bail awaiting trial and still brazen enough to show up at property they no longer owned. I knew what it meant. They wanted to reclaim the narrative one last time, to perform innocence in front of the extended family who hadn't seen the evidence firsthand. I stared at the screen for a long time before typing my reply. Confirmed. I'll be there. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation and calculation. Detective Morrison encouraged caution. "They're under restriction," he said. "If they step foot on that property, they violate bail. But don't confront them directly. Let us handle it." His words were steady, but I could tell he trusted me to create the conditions for exposure. Mr. Henson called it poetic symmetry. They used family gatherings to hide their deceit, he said. You'll use one to reveal the truth. The day of the reunion arrived with the kind of clear Texas sky that makes even bad memories look cinematic. I drove out early with a few cousins who knew the truth, Brad and Elena, both of whom had quietly distanced themselves from my mother years ago. We set up the tables, the grills, the banners. Everything looked perfectly normal, except for one thing, the projector and sound system I'd rented, placed discreetly beneath the pecan trees. I told curious cousins it was for a tribute to Grandma. Technically, that wasn't a lie. By 1 in the afternoon, cars filled the gravel drive, laughter echoing across the field. I caught fragments of conversations, speculation about the case, whispers about betrayal, pity disguised as curiosity. When Mom and Dylan finally arrived, they did it like a red carpet entrance. Dylan wore a crisp white shirt and mirrored sunglasses. Mom was in pale pink pearls glinting against her collarbone. She carried printed flyers for her legal defense fund and handed them out with a gracious smile. It's been such a tough time, she told anyone who'd listen. Families shouldn't fight over money. When she spotted me, she didn't hesitate. Nora, she called, voice sugar sweet. You look wonderful. Thank you for letting us host here. She said it loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. I smiled. It's my property, I said, keeping my tone even. You're my guest today. A few people glanced between us, sensing the tension, but not understanding its scale. Dylan pulled her aside, whispering something that made her nod. Then, like clockwork, she began her campaign. Small groups formed around her as she told her version, how I'd misunderstood Grandma's wishes, how I'd been manipulated by outsiders, how the footage had been deep-faked. I let her speak. I wanted every lie documented in the collective memory before I dismantled it. As the sun lowered, Uncle Robert, Grandma's brother, and the oldest surviving Reed stood by the porch steps and called for quiet. His voice carried the authority of old Southern respectability. Before dinner, he said, I think it's time we remember the woman who brought us all together. He gestured toward me. Nora's prepared something special. My heartbeat thudded against my ribs as I stepped forward. Grandma believed family meant accountability. I began. She taught me that truth isn't an attack, it's a duty. So today I'm sharing her story, not the version you've been told, but the one she lived. I nodded to Brad, who started the projector. The screen lit up against the twilight, first photos of Grandma smiling on the porch, then clips of her birthday parties, her handwritten notes to me, her voice from old home videos saying, "Be brave, Nora girl." The crowd murmured, softened. Then came the turn. The video shifted to the nursing home footage. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they recognized my mother Dylan and Eli in the frame. No narration, no commentary, just the silent, damning movement of a pen guided across my grandmother's limp hand. When the timestamp appeared, the murmurs turned to shouts. Someone yelled, "Is this real?" Another said, "Dear God." Mom's face drained of color. "Turn that off!" she shrieked, pushing through the crowd. "This is a setup." Dylan tried to grab the projector, but Brad stepped in front of him. "It's over," he said quietly. I kept my voice calm. The court verified it. Every file, every document. This is what they did. Then Uncle Robert raised his hand, voice trembling but firm. "You forged your mother's will," he said to Carol. "And you brought shame to this family's name. That ranch, that legacy, it belongs to the only one who honored it." His words broke something open. The cousins who'd stayed silent now turned away from her. Nancy started crying. Even distant relatives stepped back like the air around my mother had become toxic. And then, as if on cue, 2 police cruisers rolled up the dirt road. Morrison stepped out, his badge gleaming. "Carol Reed and Dylan Reed," he said, "you're both under arrest for violating bail by entering restricted property and for new charges of defamation and false reporting." My mother froze. Dylan tried to argue, but the officers had already moved forward. As they cuffed her, she twisted toward me, voice rising into a shrill echo. "You'll regret this, Nora. You'll die alone, just like your father." The words didn't land like she expected. They didn't even sting. I looked at her and said quietly enough that only she could hear, "Better alone than owned." They led her to the car lights flashing across the field. The silence afterward was heavy, punctuated only by the soft hum of the projector still playing Grandma's final video, me brushing her hair, her frail voice whispering, "You're the only one who comes because you love me." The crowd stayed rooted, watching the truth unravel the myth they'd clung to. When it ended, Uncle Robert put a hand on my shoulder. "You did what she couldn't," he said. "You ended it." I didn't feel triumphant, not yet. But as the police cars disappeared down the road, I looked at the ranch glowing under the last of the sunlight and knew this place had finally been returned to the woman who built it and to the granddaughter who refused to let her name be stolen. 6 months after the reunion, the ranch looks nothing like the hollowed shell it was. The grass is cut, the porch swing repaired, and the scent of cedar and lemon oil greets me each morning when I open the front door. I start the day with coffee on the porch, the same way Grandma used to, except now, there's laughter from the volunteers repainting the barn and the hum of a generator powering the old greenhouse. The Reed Ranch has become something new, the headquarters for the Lillian Reed Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting seniors from financial exploitation. Patricia runs daily operations, balancing empathy with grit. The foundation's hotline receives dozens of calls a week. Adult children afraid something's wrong with their parents' accounts, caregivers noticing suspicious withdrawals. Each call reminds me that my story wasn't isolated, it was a pattern waiting to be named. The legal aftermath unfolded faster than anyone expected. The evidence was airtight: 2 forged wills, banking records, witness statements, and a digital trail that showed every fraudulent transfer. My mother was convicted on multiple counts: elder fraud, forgery, and mail fraud, since she'd mailed notarized fake documents across state lines. That made it federal. She received 5 years in prison. Dylan took a plea deal, 3 years, and restitution. Eli, who fled to Arizona, was caught at the border and sentenced to 7 years. The nursing home director lost his license, and 3 more families came forward with similar stories. Justice, it turns out, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just arrives steadily, methodically, until even the liars run out of breath. I didn't attend the sentencing hearing. Mr. Henson went in my place and called afterward. "You made your point," he said. "Now you get to make your life." That's exactly what I've been doing. My design business, which nearly folded during the investigation, is thriving again. Emily left her agency to partner with me. Together we've built something grounded in integrity and balance, the two things my childhood lacked. We work out of a small studio downtown with exposed brick and an old neon sign that reads, "Earned, not owed." It's our quiet motto. Financially, I'm secure for the first time. Grandma's assets transferred fully to me after the verdict house investments and the modest savings account she'd tucked away under my name. But more than that, I inherited her peace. I found her notes hidden around the ranch, one in a recipe book, another tucked behind a picture frame. Each one is simple, written in her shaky hand. "Nora, be kind, but not blind. You were always enough." The last one was hidden in the drawer of her sewing table on stationery that smelled faintly of lavender. "Family isn't blood, it's who shows up." I read that one whenever I start doubting my choices. Not everything has been easy. The media coverage painted me as a symbol of empowerment, but fame never sits comfortably with me. Reporters still call, sometimes wanting updates on the brave woman who took on her family. I decline interviews now. The story isn't about revenge anymore, it's about boundaries. I've learned that peace and isolation aren't the same thing. The friends who stayed, the ones who showed up when the noise died down, feel like chosen family. Emily visits the ranch most weekends. Uncle Robert brings pecan pie and tells stories about Grandma's youth, and Patricia stays in the guest house when she's not in Austin for work. The house feels alive again, not haunted. A month ago, I received a letter from prison. The handwriting was unmistakable. My mother's. 8 pages of emotional manipulation disguised as remorse. She wrote that I'd misunderstood her intentions, that she only wanted to protect Grandma's estate from outsiders. She ended it with, "Despite everything you've done to me, I forgive you. A mother's love never dies." For a long time I stared at those words, trying to summon the reaction she wanted: guilt, sorrow, nostalgia. But all I felt was distance. I folded the letter back into its envelope, wrote, "Return to sender" across the front, and mailed it without hesitation. She didn't stop. 17 letters came over the next month, each one more desperate, trying new tactics, self-pity, anger, promises of reconciliation. I returned them all unopened, marking each one "no longer at this address." Because in a way, it was true. The version of me she could manipulate doesn't live here anymore. Sometimes at dusk I walk the fence line with the dogs from the neighboring property trailing beside me, and I think about that first text. "Don't come by anymore. We're done." It used to hurt to remember those words. Now they feel like a benediction. She freed me without meaning to. The woman who raised me to believe my worth was conditional had accidentally handed me the key to my own independence. The best revenge isn't wealth or even justice, it's living without apology. The foundation has started hosting educational workshops for local banks and caregivers. Patricia gives the keynote. I handle the design and community outreach. Last week we helped a woman in her 70s recover $40,000 her son had stolen through a forged power of attorney. When she hugged me afterward, I felt something shift inside a closing of the circle. Grandma's story had become a shield for others. That was the legacy my mother couldn't corrupt. On quiet nights, I still sit in Grandma's armchair, the one with the floral upholstery worn thin at the arms, and listen to the cicadas humming outside. The ranch feels different now, no longer a place of ghosts, but of continuity. I imagine Grandma sitting beside me, nodding in approval at the order I've restored. Sometimes I whisper to her, "We did it." Her voice doesn't answer, but the house creaks softly like it's agreeing. I keep that first text saved on my phone, not as a wound, but as a marker of where my old life ended. It reminds me that the worst day of my life was also the beginning of my real one. Freedom isn't lonely. It's quiet, steady, earned. It's coming home to a place that finally feels like mine, not because I inherited it, but because I reclaimed it. The family has decided, and this time, I got a vote. As Nora finally breathes out the past and closes the door on everything that once defined her, the quiet of the Reed Ranch becomes the sound of peace, hard won. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more powerful tales of family justice and redemption. Leave your thoughts below. We read every single comment you share. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.